Hey everyone, welcome to the RotoPros pre-lock show for Thursday. We've got only 4 games to talk about, so this should be a pretty quick episode. But I do think this is a potentially interesting slate. Generally, our favorite slates are the ones where we have something like 5 to 10 games, where there are some good choices, but there aren't too many good choices. There are some games that are actually worth fading, and then you can really narrow the focus and also not have too much ownership on the plays that you actually like. This is going to be kind of tough tonight because some of the offenses in better spots, one in particular, is going to be really, really heavily owned. So you have to get more creative when the slates are smaller. This one's only 4 games. Definitely need to be a little bit creative here and create some tournament upside and not just kind of play who everyone else is playing. So starting with pitchers, I think ownership actually should be pretty spread out at pitching. I don't think there really is a chalk pitcher tonight outside of probably Chris Sale. But even him, I don't think the ownership will be too high. This is kind of just speculative. It's kind of hard to forecast ownership. We don't have any algorithms for ownership. It's not really an exact science trying to predict what the people are going to do. But Sale is by far the best pitcher on the slate. The Red Sox are the biggest favorite, and Sale is really, really good and should strike out a lot of hitters tonight. So I think Sale is worth considering. I don't have a ton of interest in him because I think there are cheaper pitchers that are just better choices. So I really don't think I'll end up using a lot of Sale tonight. I guess Greg and I have both been on the same page with this recently. Well, I guess it's just these 2 days where with an expensive pitcher that seems to be fairly priced, if you're stacking a cheap enough offense where you can fit that pitcher, then use him there. But I'm not going out of my way to use Chris Sale tonight. This is probably a slightly favorable matchup for him. The Blue Jays offense is going to be about average this year, but it's below average right now with Josh Donaldson on the DL. It is a road game, though, and that's always a little bit worse for everybody. So Chris Sale, I think, is fine, but he's probably my third, maybe even fourth priority at pitcher. So here are the pitchers that I actually do think are really worth targeting. Dylan Bundy, number one. Bundy has been really, really good this year. His swinging strike percentage is above 17%. He's generating an incredible amount of whiffs, and his strikeout rate is above 11 Ks per nine. Bundy's been really good, and he's facing probably the worst offense in baseball. So I mentioned this on the podcast last night. I'll just reiterate it now. The Rays doing well against Alex Cobb says basically nothing about their ability as an offense. Alex Cobb is just not in MLB shape right now. He didn't have spring training. I don't even know if he's good at all, but he had a shoulder injury 2 years ago, hasn't been good since. And he's even worse right now because he just hasn't pitched enough. So rusty Alex Cobb doing well against that, I don't think really means anything for Tampa's offense. It's still a very strikeout-prone offense. It's not a very good offense. Bundy's price, I think as the season progresses, we will see Bundy cost around 9,000 to 10,000 most nights. And this is a really favorable matchup at home. So Bundy is the priority pitching target. I think I'll have him not quite every lineup, but pretty close to it. I think Bundy is the strongest play by far tonight at pitcher. So other pitching choices there, well, Sale for sure is on the table. I think Kyle Hendricks is just really underpriced. I don't love Kyle Hendricks as a pitcher. He usually doesn't get a lot of strikeouts. He's facing a decent Brewers offense that struck out a lot last year, but they have Christian Yelich now. They have Lorenzo Cain now. It should be a better offense. Eric Thames is injured and out of the lineup. So the strikeout upside is lower than it was last year, but the price is just too low for Hendricks. That's the bottom line. He's probably an above average pitcher, only 6,900 at home. I think this is probably neutral matchup against the Brewers, who have a decent offense, but they are a little strikeout prone, and it is a home game. So this is just a salary savings pick with Hendricks. He will definitely help you fit whatever offense you want into lineups. So a Bundy-Hendricks combo leaves open a lot of salary to kind of just use whatever hitters you want. If you want to stack the Red Sox, that's the most expensive offense tonight and probably the highest expected output. So using Hendricks definitely works in that regard. but I don't have a ton of interest in him either. And the more I look at Chris Archer, I'm a little bit tempted here. Archer has been struggling this year for sure. Part of the reason that my initial thought was to fade him was because he would have some ownership. He's always worse on the road. If people are going to use Archer in a road game, you can get some leverage against him by stacking the other side. But Archer's ERA this year is 6.59, and the Rays are actually underdogs in this game. So I don't know how much people will use Chris Archer. I think the way that I'm going to play this is I will have some Archer exposure, but I also will stack the Orioles game, stack the Orioles side of the game. This is really the only game I feel that way about tonight, outside of maybe just throwing in a Blue Jays stack to counter Chris Sale's ownership. But I think like this game could definitely go pretty heavily one way or another. If Chris Archer doesn't pitch well, the Orioles are going to get to face the Tampa bullpen, which is not very good. And there's a lot of upside for them in a hitter's park. But the Orioles also strike out a ton. Chris Archer is a really good strikeout pitcher. His K rate is down this year, but his swinging strike percentage is actually up. So I think it's a little bit fluky that his K percentage is down. And the rest of his pitching metrics look about the same. He's throwing strikes actually more often than he did last year. He's throwing the ball. First strikes percentage is up. Zone percentage is up. Zone contact percentage is up, but outside zone contact is down. I think this is just kind of early season flukiness. Archer's always a little bit worse on the road. Well, he's always a lot worse on the road. But this is the Orioles. They strike out a lot. They're a little bit banged up right now. They don't have Colby Rasmus. That was one of their key offseason pickups. They don't have Mark Trumbo. They don't have Jonathan Scope. That's the biggest guy who's out of the lineup. So this is a decent spot for Archer. He's cheaper than Bundy. I definitely prefer Bundy to Archer, but I think you can use Archer also. So for me, the pitching order of exposure will be Bundy number 1. And then it's really going to be a mix 2 through 4. I think Sale, Archer, and Hendricks. I'll probably end up with Hendricks the second most. But I think all 3 of those guys are worth having some of, and maybe I do end up with Bundy in every lineup, and it's just kind of a third each of the other 3 guys. So that's all for pitching. I guess I'll mention why I'm not using Jake Junis. If you are a RotoPros subscriber, I wrote up a blurb about Junis that you can find there, Vegas line breakdown. But the gist of it is that the sharp money for that game, for the Royals-White Sox game, is really heavily on the over. The total is moved by a full run from 8.5 to almost 9.5. And that's without any public bias. The over-under betting is pretty split. So it's all sharp betting on the over, and that's with Jose Abreu out of the lineup. And it's with a bias on the Royals side of the game. So the implied run total for the White Sox is going up against the public on both fronts. The public is basically betting the Royals and under. So the public is siding with Jake Junis here. He's a little expensive. His peripheral stats are not very good. He's kind of just an average pitcher, and he's just, I mean, I'd rather use Chris Archer. I think he's better by a lot, and he has more strikeout upside. I don't know about ownership for Junis. I think he kind of could be the same as Archer. So I don't love either guy, but I'd rather use Archer than Junis. And yeah, I don't think Junis has the strikeout upside even against the White Sox to be worth considering at 8,300. So that's it for me at pitcher. Let's see what we've got for offense. I'll start in the most obvious spot. The Red Sox are going to be really, really highly owned. Mookie Betts could even be 40+% tonight in some tournaments. I think there's merit to using him because it's a really strong matchup against Marco Estrada, who's right-handed. Betts is right-handed, but that's actually a good thing for the Red Sox righties because Estrada is a very large reverse splits pitcher, which is usually the case with pitchers who rely on their changeups, and Estrada definitely does that. So yeah, he's usually worse against righties year after year, even though he is a righty. Betts is expensive, and a lot of people are going to have him. So unless he's going to need a pretty big game to be worth considering. Like, I mean, if Mookie goes 2 for 4 with a couple singles and scores 8 to 10 fantasy points and you don't have him, I think you can build combinations that end up being better than that. It's also baseball. It's random. Maybe Betts goes 0 for 4 or 0 for 5. I don't know. He's been really good lately, though, and I think everyone's going to use him. So the biggest source of potential leverage tonight, I don't think is fading any particular pitcher. I think it's fading Mookie Betts. I think other Red Sox will have a lot less ownership, but people are going to pay up for Mookie Betts because, well, he hit 2 home runs yesterday. He had a 3-homer game last week. There aren't really any other expensive guys to pay up for, at least not in the outfield. Let's see what we've got here. Yeah, so Betts is the only player on the entire slate that's priced over 5,000 on DraftKings. Machado is at 5,000, but he's a shortstop. So if you're paying up for an outfielder, Betts is the guy. Outfielders usually have more ownership than other positions because there are 3 of them that you can use. So it's easier to get an outfielder into a lineup. So I think I might use Mookie Betts as a plug in lineups that are already very contrarian. Because if you have a contrarian lineup, let's say like a White Sox stack, or let's say it's a Blue Jays stack, then you don't have to worry about being too chalky in some of your other lineup spots. Like once you've got players that are all single-digit ownership across the board, your lineup build is going to be unique enough that you don't have to worry about Mookie Betts being too chalky in that sort of lineup. But overall, I have no interest in Mookie for the most part because of his ownership. I think JD Martinez will be the second most popular Red Sox player. He's a better hitter, I think, than Mookie Betts. He's cheaper than Mookie Betts. He gets the same platoon advantage going righty versus righty against Estrada. I think his ownership will be very high, but it'll be lower than Betts by some amount, maybe to the point where I think you can use JD Martinez. I'm not going to be going out of my way to target him. But if I have the salary left to use an expensive Red Sox player, I think Martinez is the guy I want, not Betts, because there is going to be a difference ownership-wise between them, even if they are both pretty chalky. So I'm more okay with Martinez, but I don't really want to use too much of either of them because of ownership. Moving down the Red Sox lineup, well, because Estrada is such a strong reverse splits pitcher, I don't really like Benintendi and Devers too much. If you're stacking the Red Sox, I think they're fine, but I think they're not the best plays tonight. There are other guys at their positions. There are plenty of outfielders to use. Third base is a strong position tonight with, let's see, Travis Shaw and Mike Moustakas is probably the main one. And Devers is batting 7th tonight. So I don't really have any interest in him. I think Mitch Moreland is okay, I guess, but I'd actually rather use Hanley. Eduardo Nunez is interesting. He's second base and shortstop eligible. So Nunez probably is my favorite Red Sox player. I think you can use Christian Vasquez. 2,200 for anyone basically is worth looking at. But it's a righty against Estrada in a strong lineup. So I think Vasquez is fine too. But yeah, I don't think I'll be stacking Boston at all. And I think you can plug them a little bit. But obviously it's a pretty good stack. They have the highest implied total on the slate. Estrada is bad. The Blue Jays bullpen is okay, but I guess it depends how risky you want to be. It's definitely a risk to fade the Red Sox tonight, but I do think it's a risk worth taking. I didn't actually mention Estrada on the other side. There certainly is leverage in using Estrada against Boston if they're going to be the highest owned offense, but even if Estrada is able to limit the Red Sox, I don't think the upside for him is quite high enough. He's just not that good, and there are enough good pitching choices around him. You also don't need to go cheap at pitcher too much if you're fading the Red Sox, because the Red Sox are the only really expensive team anyway. So in a Red Sox fade, I'd rather just use Bundy, Archer, Hendricks, and not really Estrada. Although it wouldn't be the worst idea to maybe throw him into one lineup that doesn't include Red Sox players. It worked in the afternoon with Kyle Gibson, and that didn't seem possible either. So who knows? And Trevor Richards struck out 10 Dodgers last night. So I guess any pitcher can do anything at any time is the bottom line there. But I don't think Estrada is a particularly good bet tonight. So I'll be sticking with the pitchers I mentioned before. Other offenses to use. So the Orioles are probably a decent leverage play against Archer, but I don't think his ownership will be that high. And something interesting about Archer this year specifically is he's been awful against left-handed batters, but he's actually been really good against righties. I don't know where these splits have come from. It's a pretty small sample, but you don't need too large of a sample for strikeout rate and walk rate. Those things tend to become stable pretty quickly. So against righties this year, Archer 13.2 Ks per nine, 1.8 walks per nine. He's dominating right-handed batters, 192 FIP and 239 xFIP. But against lefties, 5.1 Ks per nine, 5.1 walks per nine, 797 FIP and 551 xFIP. So Archer has been just abysmal against lefties. The way I want to approach the Orioles, I think, is have a couple full stacks, because if they get to the Rays bullpen, there's a lot of upside, and Archer is just not that good on the road. But I do like the Orioles lefties as plugs more than anything. That's my favorite way to attack the Orioles tonight. So Jace Peterson is not a particularly good hitter, but he is batting second, and he's cheap, and he has dual position eligibility at second and third. So I think Jace Peterson at 2,900 is a decent play. Chris Davis, 3,300, Pedro Alvarez, 3,000. There's a lot of home run upside for both of those guys, even though both of them strike out a lot. So boomer bust picks there. The Orioles, I think, are just not a great team to stack in general because they're very reliant on homers. So you could have a game pretty easily where they score 3 runs and it comes on 3 solo homers. That would not surprise me at all tonight. So I do want exposure to them as plugs mostly. And I think Alvarez and Davis are the primary targets. I think Anthony Santander's fine. I think Jace Peterson's fine. I think if you can pay up for Machado and you have extra salary in a lineup with cheaper pitching, then Machado's fine too. But that's probably about it for the Orioles. They're a decent choice for me tonight, but they're not one of my favorites. So Blue Jays offense against Sale. I mean, it's a really, really hard matchup. You'd be doing it purely for tournament leverage, and maybe I'll have one lineup that uses them out of 20. I think it's a pretty bad spot for the Rays. I don't think Bundy's ownership will be quite high enough where you are getting too much leverage on Tampa. It's just a really bad matchup against a pretty good pitcher. Tampa's offense just isn't very good also. If there's one Rays player to use, it's Brad Miller. He's pretty underpriced at 2,900, but that's it from the Rays. So we have 2 games left to target. The other 2 games, Cubs, Brewers. I think Hendricks is decent enough where I don't really want to pay up for Brewers guys because they actually are pretty pricey. Kane, Yelich, Braun, and Shaw are all in the 4,000 to 5,000 range. So I think the prices are just too high for those guys. Domingo Santana batting 5th at 3,200. I think he's a better play, but I don't really have much interest in a Brewers stack tonight. It also looks like there's some decent sharp money on the under here, although that probably has a lot to do with Chris Bryant being out of the lineup. So, yeah, no betting line indications for the Brewers. They're just a little expensive in, I guess, sort of a slightly negative matchup against Kyle Hendricks. But on the Cubs side, without Bryant, Bryant not being in there downgrades the offense as a whole. So I don't have a ton of interest in stacking the Cubs without him. It's just not really a very good lineup. Like, Anthony Rizzo is a great hitter. Kyle Schwarber has a lot of power, and Javier Baez has actually been really good this year. I'm not sure how much of that I'd buy, but I think Baez is worth considering. The rest of the Cubs, though, are just kind of average at best. Almora, Tommy La Stella, Caratini, Russell, Hayward. La Stella is probably a good play anyway because of how cheap he is at 2,200. But as far as stacking the Cubs, even though Chase Anderson is really overrated and really dramatically outperforming his peripheral numbers, I still don't think the expected output for the Cubs is that high without Chris Bryant. Like, he is their best player by a lot, and the overall run production for the team just drops off without him. So I think you can plug Rizzo. I think he's kind of underpriced at 4,400. But Schwarber and Baez are a bit expensive, and everyone else just isn't that good. So my 2 favorite targets on the Cubs are Rizzo and then also Tommy La Stella if you need the salary savings. My favorite game for offense, and actually both sides of it, I think are going to be my 2 highest owned offenses, is this Royals-White Sox game. So I mentioned Junis being overrated. There's a lot of sharp money on the over in this game, and people may be rostering Junis, so that's going to keep the White Sox ownership down a little bit. They also don't have Jose Abreu tonight. So this is a very weird White Sox lineup. Yohan Moncada is probably a little expensive, but he's just been so good this year, and he was one of the most highly regarded prospects in baseball before last season. So I think Moncada is good enough where 4,400 is fine to use in stacks. I probably wouldn't plug Moncada because there are just better values, but in game stacks, I think he's fine. The rest of this lineup, I think it's just that Jake Junis is not very good, and the Royals bullpen is really bad. So the White Sox hitters, they're still major league hitters, and they're really cheap, and they could get pretty favorable matchups throughout the game. It's a decent matchup against Junis to start the game, and then it's only going to get easier when the Royals bring in their whole bullpen is really bad. So Tim Anderson, Yolmer Sanchez, Wellington Castillo, Daniel Palka, and Matt Davidson. I mean, it's really hard to know what to make of these guys. Davidson had an incredible start to the year, kind of cooled off, then fell out of the starting lineup. But whether Davidson is actually a good hitter or not, he definitely has a lot of power. There's home run upside for him, no matter what you think of him. Daniel Palka is a prospect who has some power too. He's 2,900, batting fifth, can play first in outfield. I think he's fine. But this White Sox stack, I think, will just be really, really under-owned against a mediocre pitcher and a bad bullpen. The Vegas line movement supports the White Sox. So that's probably my second favorite offense after the Royals, who are going to be my favorite offense. I am a little worried about ownership with the Royals. The Red Sox definitely should be chalkier, but the Royals should be pretty popular too. One issue with the Royals that kind of pops up when you're building lineups is that Lucas Duda and Mike Moustakas play the same positions as Pedro Alvarez and Chris Davis, so you can't use Orioles lefty plugs with the Royals. So I think the way I'm going to go, because I can't really, there's no one really else I like from the Orioles too much. I think the Royals make the most sense in Archer-Bundy combinations. The Royals are also a little bit cheaper tonight because Whit Merrifield's out, which does hurt their expected output a little bit. But Merrifield is kind of just a decent hitter who's good for fantasy because he steals bases, but he was too expensive anyway, I think. So this current lineup with Jay, Almonte, Moustakas, Perez, Duda, there actually are some decent hitters now. Like 3 through 5 in that lineup is good offensively. With Salvador Perez back, the Royals are not as bad at offense as they were before. So I like that court a lot. I think they'll be really popular, but I think lower than the Red Sox by a substantial enough amount where I'm not too worried about ownership there. And Lucas Giolito is just he's just bad. So yeah, Harris, I've done this show from, I think, 15 different setups in the last 30 days. I just like to move around different states for some of them, different cities, talk about how bad the White Sox are from everywhere and how bad the Rays offense is. But yeah, I do really like the White Sox offense and the Royals offense. The prices are reasonable on both sides, lean towards the Royals in this game. And I think the main reason that the total in this game is so much higher than what would be expected of offenses of this quality is that the bullpens are bad. And we don't usually take bullpens into account enough for DFS. And there's usually some hidden upside there when you have a decent starter but a really bad bullpen behind him. When that starter comes out of the game, the other team's offense can do really, really well. So I think that's the case for Jake Junis tonight. I also think it's the case for Bundy and Archer. But Bundy and Archer are much better pitchers than Jake Junis. So I'm not playing for the upside of those opposing offenses. All right. I think that probably does it. If anyone watching has questions, let me know. Just cover some plugs quickly. I probably mentioned most of them, but Tommy La Stella is 2,200. Christian Vasquez is 2,200. Those are the best salary saving options tonight. Favorite players on the slate are probably Salvador Perez and Lucas Duda, priced in the mid 3,000s in a really good matchup. And just a full recap, favorite pitchers, it's Bundy by a lot with Sale, Hendricks, and Chris Archer, I think is the secondary choices. And then offenses, Royals number 1, White Sox number 2. I think the Orioles are a number 3, kind of Cubs in the same group. But for those two teams, I'm more interested in just using plugs like Rizzo, La Stella, Alvarez, Chris Davis. So Orioles and Cubs mostly plugs. I probably will stack the White Sox and Royals with the majority of lineups. So that's going to wrap it up. Thanks for watching, everyone, and we'll be back. Actually, let me address this game stacking both teams question from YouTube. So if you wanted to make a lineup with both teams from the White Sox and Royals game, there isn't, I guess I've mentioned this briefly before, there isn't too much value in baseball like in other sports where stacking both sides of a game creates more upside. So in basketball, if you use players from both teams, you're playing for overtime basically. And if you get that scenario, then all of the players will benefit. In football, it's the most pronounced because when one team scores quickly, the other team now has the ball. So the quicker one team scores, the more possessions the other team's going to get. And usually teams are trying to keep pace with the other teams, and their play calling reflects it. We don't get any of that in baseball. Teams that are down a lot of runs can't play faster. So there really isn't any added benefit to stacking a game together. The only real upside there is if the game goes to extra innings for long enough, but that situation is only marginally beneficial anyway because some runs being scored in extra innings will just end the game. And it's a pretty rare occurrence also. So I'm not going out of my way to stack the White Sox and Royals in the same lineup, but I'll probably do it just because I do like both teams. So if you were doing that, I would probably try to include Moustakas, Perez, Duda, and Jay. Use Tim Anderson. Yohan Moncada would be in there too because there isn't really a second baseman to use on the Royals with Merrifield out. So the core for a game stack would be Moustakas, Perez, Duda, Moncada, Tim Anderson, and some other White Sox outfielders. They have a few to choose from. They're all not great, but they're all also really cheap. So it's kind of just whoever fits. And all right, that'll do it for real this time. And yeah, back tomorrow. See you all then.